Now, you gave us a great origin story there for SRE, for site reliability engineering. Talk to us a little bit about SLOs. We've touched on that topic. Let's start to uncover that a little bit. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing to say is what SLO stands for. I mean, it's related to other concepts you may or may not have heard of, SLIs, but SLAs as well, which I suppose are more broadly known in the industry. The expansion of the acronym SLA is service level agreement, but here we'll really be focusing on SLIs, but mostly SLOs, service level indicators and service level objectives. And the basic idea here is that software, while it's running, collects information about how it's running, names this information, which we'll call a metric. For example, total number of requests or something like that. Every time you have a new request, you add a number to that. And SLOs are objectives for some of those numbers, or some of those metrics, to be more precise, which ideally, like this is the idea, are connected to user journeys or things that the user is trying to get done with your software. And so the real innovation here is not necessarily the idea of metrics, well established. If you come from the business world, KPIs are exactly the same thing, except with different letters, because, and the innovation isn't necessarily in the idea that there should be targets for things. That's also not without precedent in the world. But the innovation really in the domain of SLOs is, when you come from an IT background, the idea that actually this is a conversation between business and engineering about what exact experience the users should have with the software. And often this is expressed as some number, like often composed of nines, decimal points, and fives. So 99.5% availability or something. Every request for creating an account should complete within, 99.5% of requests for completing an account should complete within 200 milliseconds or equivalent. So you're basically looking at the things your software is doing, which support user journeys or tasks that the users want to accomplish, and agreeing between business and engineering what that should be. And it turns out that this is a tremendously powerful kind of organizational hack, because harking back to the previous conversation where we say running things is difficult and so on, like part of the reason why running things is difficult is because it's easy for decision makers to be relatively insulated from the effects of what's going on, the kind of Sturm und Drang of day-to-day work. And it turns out that if you have a situation like that, you get inefficiencies and bad user outcomes because you're not connecting through the intent of the business with what the user experience should be, with how prioritization should work in engineering. And it's really SLOs as prioritization mechanism, which I think is the big thing here.
I love it. I love that it's that conversation. I think you quantified it as the innovation is really how to have that conversation between business and engineering. And, it's so important because a lot of times, you're right, metrics aren't new. And a lot of times metrics just feel arbitrary without the context of what the customer expects. I mean, and really pulling the customer and business into that conversation, hopefully gets you to some numbers that make a lot of sense. Ian, I want to flip it over to you a little bit. Niall talked about an origin story of SRE being in Google and, in the early 2000s, right? Why are we talking about this today? Why Noble 9 today? You guys have an SLO platform, kind of help bring us up to speed where you guys kind of see this opportunity and where the conversation is.
Yeah. So kind of like what Niall was saying, running things is hard. turns out doing SLOs and error budgets are also hard. If you're at Google and you can have teams like dedicated to running these platforms, calculating these error budgets and whatnot, great, that's awesome. But a lot of places, a lot of startups, a lot of companies and organizations don't have the resources to be able to do that, and also that kind of domain knowledge about what are the maths. How do these get calculated? And so that's where we come in. We handle like the math on the calculations, the processing of all of those. These are all like pretty big lifts, to be honest. Also, just pulling the metrics. We have agents that pull from our data, from our integrations into the data sources. That's also something that's not an easy lift. You would have to build all those integrations yourself if you wanted to roll your own. And again, these are things that larger organizations I know have and can do. But we're looking at other organizations that maybe don't want to take on that burden, aren't able to, and do that. I talked about error budgets. Error budgets are also hard to, there's a lot of math involved in that, and to talk about what error budgets are. Now I kind of led into this talking about, the decision mechanism. Error budgets are also that decision mechanisms. They measure how your SLI is doing against your SLO over time. They just kind of define how unreliable your service is permitted to be over that time window. So it will be that a day, week, a month, or whatever it is. The way that you calculate what your error budget is you subtract what your SLO is. So let's say that's 99% or 95. Well, actually for this, let's say it's 99%. You subtract that from 1, you get 1%. So you have a 1% error budget over whatever time window you've defined. So if you're measuring that SLO in minutes of downtime, that your error budget would be minutes over that time window of downtime that you're allowed to have. And that serves as your decision mechanism. You can say, like, if you're still within your error budget, cool, keep shipping features. If you have exhausted your error budget, might be time to have your team pivot and focus on reliability for that time and stop feature work. Henrik has talked about the quality gate. That's something that's this is what that is. You can stop your deployments if you've exhausted your error budget until that error budget builds back up and you're within your parameters.
Love it. When I was first introduced to the concept of error budget, obviously probably much later than you guys were, what it brought home for me was that, again, it's what you were talking about. Like, what does the business and the customer experience expect? And there's a certain level of errors that we're comfortable with, and we don't have to set our engineering team on fire every time that there's a problem, because not all problems are necessarily bad for the customer, and they could stifle innovation. So if we put all of our effort into solving every single problem that comes up, then we're choking out innovation. So I don't know. It's a really powerful concept. Henrik, I'd like to hear from you, on this topic of SLOs, SLIs, and kind of get your perspective on it and how you see it.
So what I'd like to, first of all, Dynatrace is one of the biggest observability platforms. So we collect metrics, events, traces, whatever. And since many years ago, people were managing their environment based on alerting. Alerts are great. But if we make an analogy with sports, it's like I'm preparing for a marathon, and my heart is going too high, so I get an alert from the watch. But does this alert help me to be better and reach the targets of the marathon? No, you need objectives. You need to define them properly and follow those objectives. And I think we just implement those practices that we have in sports or other practices in the IT, and that's wonderful. So the SLI, just to add, it's a metric, but it's more than a metric. For me, it's a ratio. So you need to basically, if you want to put a ratio on your response times, then you have to define what is an acceptable response times. And then you will calculate the number of requests that was respecting your acceptable response times versus the number of requests in total. And then you will get that ratio. And that with that ratio, you will be able to put an SLO. And this is great. I mean, we have a lot of customers that has started to understand the concept of SLIs, understand the concept of SLOs, and they are basically utilizing it in their production environment, but also before, like Jan just mentioned, the quality gates. They want to have a systems, and I just mentioned before, that will allow them to basically make sure that they are always close to the targets that they have defined, and that target will allow them to promote their release to the production, to staging or other environments. So we have customers that utilize, I mean, we have built since 4 or 5 years now. We have a framework called Captain, and Captain is using this concepts of SLI and SLO, and we have the quality gate. So we have customers using the open source version of Captain, and also we have customers using the SaaS version, which is cloud automation SaaS that we provide. And they are basically, as a feedback we have received recently, says we are not shipping any release in production without Dynatrace's blessing. And I think that is just, first of all, it's just great to receive that type of feedback from the customers. But that shows how powerful the method, the practice is, because they are saving so much time. They're able to have a feedback on how reliable their releases is in just a few minutes, compared to a few months ago where they were waiting 60 or 35 hours to get a manual feedback from someone. So that's just, I think it's amazing.
That is a great story. I mean, I love it. It's great to hear customer stories and how they're interacting and solving problems. I think that's one of the things I really enjoy. And in the role of being a consultant is just hearing from different customers. So I think that's great.